There is a photograph from 1933 that captured the imagination of a nation in the grip of the Great Depression. It shows a young woman stepping out of a limousine, her face framed by a halo of platinum blonde hair, draped in a mink coat that cost more than most American families would earn in a decade. She is 21 years old, she is impossibly beautiful, and she has just inherited one of the largest fortunes in the history of the world. The press called her the gold dust twin. They called her the Woolworth heiress. But if you look at the set of her mouth, you don't see a girl celebrating a windfall. You see a girl who is bracing herself for a blow. Her name was Barbara Hutton. To the public, she was the personification of the American dream. A girl who had everything before she had even begun to live. But beneath the diamonds and the headlines was a woman whose foundation had been cracked before she could even walk. She was a girl who learned very early that money could buy a palace, a title, and a husband, but it could never buy back the one thing she truly needed, the warmth of a mother who stayed. Barbara's story began not with a silver spoon, but with a scream. In 1917, when Barbara was only 4 years old, she walked into her mother's bedroom in the luxurious Plaza Hotel in New York. There, she found the body of Edna Woolworth. Her mother had taken her own life, a victim of a philandering husband and a profound, hollow loneliness that no amount of retail wealth could fill. It was Barbara who discovered the body. It was Barbara who carried that image into every ballroom and every marriage for the rest of her life. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, was a man who preferred the company of mistresses to the company of his daughter. Following the funeral, he effectively abandoned Barbara, shunting her off to a series of cold, cavernous mansions owned by her grandparents and various governesses. She was the richest girl in the world, but she grew up in a profound, echoing silence. She moved through the corridors of the Woolworth estate like a ghost, surrounded by the finest art and the most expensive toys. Yet she was fundamentally an orphan of the heart. By the time she reached her teens, the Woolworth fortune, built on the five and dime stores that served the working class, had grown into a monstrous, uncontrollable beast. On her 21st birthday, in the absolute nadir of the Great Depression, Barbara came into her full inheritance, $42 million. In today's currency, that is nearly $1 billion. The timing was a tragedy in itself. While millions of Americans were standing in breadlines and losing their homes, Barbara was throwing a debutante ball that cost $60,000. She served caviar and champagne while the country starved. The press, which had once adored her, turned on her with a predatory snarl. She became the face of excess, a symbol of the heartless elite. She didn't understand the optics, she only understood the void. She thought that if she spent enough, if the party was loud enough, she might finally stop hearing the silence of that hotel room in 1917. But the world was watching, and among those watching were men who saw Barbara not as a woman, but as a bank account with a pulse. She was entering a world where she was the ultimate prize, a girl who had never been taught how to be loved, only how to be valued. She was beautiful, she was fragile, and she was dangerously, catastrophically wealthy. The spiral was about to begin, because Barbara Hutton was about to learn that when you have everything, you have a target on your back that never goes away. And her first mistake would be believing that a prince could save her from her own shadow. In the 1930s, the American heiress was the ultimate export. For the crumbling aristocracies of Europe, these women were dollar princesses, vibrant, wealthy Americans who could trade their fortunes for a coat of arms and a seat at the table of history. But Barbara Hutton didn't just want a title. She wanted a sanctuary. She wanted a man whose lineage was so ancient and whose status was so secure that he could never be intimidated by her money. She wanted someone to tell her who she was, because the girl in the mirror was still just a 4-year-old child lost in the Plaza Hotel. Enter Prince Alexis Mdivani. He was part of the Marrying Mdivanis, a family of Georgian exiles who possessed nothing but stunning looks, dubious titles, and an apex predator's instinct for wealthy women. Alexis was charming, he was exotic, and he saw in Barbara a fortune that could fund a lifetime of polo ponies and champagne. They were married in 1933 in a ceremony of such staggering opulence that it served as a second insult to the American public suffering through the Depression. Barbara believed she had bought herself a fairy tale. She settled $1 million dowry on her prince and began a frantic, globe-trotting life of luxury. But the reality of the marriage was a cold shower. Alexis was not interested in Barbara's soul. He was interested in her checkbook. He criticized her weight, he mocked her American commonness, and he spent her money with a speed that even she found breathtaking. He bought a stable of ponies and a fleet of cars, while Barbara retreated into a growing obsession with her own perceived flaws. This was the era when Barbara began her lifelong battle with her body. Stung by her husband's remarks, she began a dangerous regime of starvation dieting, consuming little more than black coffee and crackers. The Woolworth heiress was becoming a wraith. She was surrounded by the finest chefs in the world, yet she was slowly disappearing. It was the only thing she felt she could control in a world where everyone else was taking a piece of her. The marriage to Mdivani lasted only 2 years. It cost her millions in settlements and left her even more fragile than before. But instead of retreating, Barbara did what she would do for the rest of her life. She doubled down. Within 24 hours of her divorce from the prince being finalized, she married Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow. If Mdivani was a parasite, Reventlow was a prison warden, a Danish aristocrat with a cruel streak and an iron will. He wanted total control over Barbara's fortune and her life. He moved her to London, where he built Winfield House, a mansion of 40 rooms meant to rival the palaces of royalty. But inside those 40 rooms, Barbara was a captive. Reventlow isolated her from her friends, bullied her into changing her citizenship from American to Danish, and reportedly subjected her to verbal and physical abuse. In 1936, Barbara gave birth to her only child, a son named Lance. It should have been a moment of healing, a chance to break the cycle of abandonment that had haunted her since her mother's death. But Barbara was too broken to be the mother she never had. She was terrified of the responsibility, terrified that she would pass on her own curse. She loved Lance, but she loved him through a veil of nanny-controlled distance and expensive gifts. By 1938, the marriage to the Count had become a public scandal. Barbara was hospitalized several times for nervous exhaustion, a 1930s euphemism for a total mental and physical breakdown. The richest girl in the world was now a woman who couldn't sleep without pills and couldn't eat without fear. She had traded her American freedom for a European title, and all she had to show for it was a son she didn't know how to raise and a heart that was being systematically hollowed out. The world was on the brink of war, and Barbara Hutton was on the brink of a personal abyss. She had spent a fortune trying to buy a protector, only to find that the men she hired were the very people she needed protection from. She was about to return to America, a woman of 26, who felt like she had lived 100 years of sorrow. And it was there, in the bright lights of Hollywood, that she would meet the only man who might have actually loved her, and the man she would eventually drive away. By 1939, Barbara Hutton was fleeing more than just a failed marriage. She was fleeing a continent on the verge of self-destruction. She returned to the United States, but she did not return to the high society ballrooms of New York. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the West, toward Hollywood, a place where everyone was a reinvented version of themselves, and where glamour was the only currency that mattered more than cash. She arrived in California as a woman in search of a soul, and it was there, amidst the palm trees and the artificial light, that she met the man who would become her third husband, Cary Grant. The pairing was a paradox that the press couldn't get enough of. He was the world's most charming leading man, a self-made icon of class and wit. She was the world's most tragic heiress, a woman born into a mountain of money she didn't know how to carry. They were dubbed Cash and Carey, a nickname that Barbara found deeply wounding. For the first time in her life, she was with a man who didn't need her money. Grant was wealthy in his own right, famously frugal, and genuinely protective. He didn't want a dowry, he wanted a partner. For a brief, shimmering moment, it looked as though the poor little rich girl had finally found her sanctuary. Grant tried to ground her. He encouraged her to eat, to sleep, to find interests beyond the jewelers' catalogues and the gossip columns. He was the only one of her 7 husbands who never asked for a settlement when the end finally came. But Barbara was already too far gone. The trauma of her mother's death and the years of abuse from her previous husbands had left her with a skinless vulnerability. She was addicted to the high of being pursued, but she was terrified of the reality of being known. She didn't know how to live a quiet life. To Barbara, love was only real if it was a grand, dramatic performance. When the cameras stopped clicking and the guests went home, she was left with the one person she couldn't stand: herself. During the war years, Barbara tried to perform the role of the patriotic American. She donated millions to the war effort. She worked for the Red Cross, and she famously gave up her Danish citizenship to reclaim her American status, a move that forced her to pay millions in back taxes. She wanted the public to love her. She wanted to be seen as more than a five and dime princess. But the more she gave, the more the public seemed to resent her. To a nation rationing sugar and scrap metal, her life of effortless luxury felt like a provocation. Her marriage to Grant began to fracture under the weight of her mounting insecurities and her growing dependence on drugs. Barbara had discovered the doctor-prescribed cocktails of the era: barbiturates to sleep, amphetamines to wake up. She was living in a chemical haze, a world where the edges blurred and the pain was muffled. Grant, a man who valued control and discipline, watched helplessly as she drifted further away from the shore. They divorced in 1945. It was the most successful relationship of her life, and yet it left her more convinced than ever that she was unlovable. If Cary Grant, the most desired man in the world, couldn't save her, who could? She was 33 years old. She was still beautiful, still the richest woman on the planet, but the gold dust was beginning to look like ash. She left Hollywood and headed for the international social circuit: Tangier, Paris, the Riviera. She was no longer looking for a husband. She was looking for a distraction. She was entering her nomad phase, a decades-long flight from a reality she could no longer face, without a pill in her hand and a diamond on her finger. The war was over for the world, but for Barbara Hutton, the most devastating battles were still to come. She was about to enter a cycle of marrying for the sake of marriage, a desperate, expensive attempt to fill a hole that was now the size of a kingdom. After the war, Barbara Hutton did not return to a home. She returned to a lifestyle. She had become a sovereign nation of one, a woman whose true residence was not a city, but a suite of rooms at the Ritz or a villa behind high stone walls. In 1946, she purchased a sprawling estate in the heart of the Kasbah in Tangier, Morocco. She called it Sidi Hosni. It was a labyrinth of marble, cedarwood, and silk, a place where the air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and the sound of fountains. But to those who saw her there, it wasn't a home. It was a fortress, designed to keep the world out and her demons in. In Tangier, Barbara became a legend of the international set. She would be carried through the narrow streets in a sedan chair like an ancient empress, draped in jewels that could have funded a city. She threw parties that lasted for days, flown in musicians and crates of champagne, creating a frantic, hollow gaiety. But the host was rarely present. Barbara was retreating further into a twilight world. She was now eating so little that she weighed less than 90 pounds. She was a ghost haunting her own palace, living on a diet of Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and a pharmacy's worth of pills. The men in her life were now becoming increasingly transparent in their motives. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a champion racing driver. He was handsome, he was daring, and he lasted 4 years before the suffocating weight of Barbara's needs and her chemical dependencies drove him away. When he filed for divorce, Barbara attempted to take her own life. It was a cry for help that the world heard as just another headline. Then came the marriage that would define the absurdity of her search. Porfirio Rubirosa. He was the world's most famous playboy, a Dominican diplomat whose reputation in the bedroom was as legendary as his skill on the polo field. They were married in 1953. The marriage lasted exactly 53 days. Rubirosa didn't even pretend to love her. He spent the honeymoon with his mistress, Zez Gabor, using Barbara's money to buy Gabor jewels and his own private jet. Barbara paid him $2.5 million just to go away. She was now a woman who was literally paying for the privilege of being humiliated. But amidst the wreckage of her romantic life, there was a growing, terrifying isolation from her only son, Lance. He was a young man now, struggling to find his own identity in the shadow of the Woolworth name. Barbara loved him with a desperate intensity, but she was a woman who only knew how to express love through the medium of the checkbook. She bought him cars, she bought him planes, she bought him estates, but she couldn't give him a mother who was sober or a mother who was present. By the mid-1950s, the richest girl in the world had become a figure of pity. She was now on her sixth husband, Baron Gottfried von Kram, a German tennis star and a man of genuine integrity who tried, as Grant had, to save her. But Barbara was beyond saving. She was no longer a person. She was a collection of symptoms. She was suffering from chronic malnutrition, kidney failure, and a soul-crushing depression that no diamond could brighten. She began to give her money away with a frantic, reckless generosity. She would hand out 5-carat rings to waitresses. She would give expensive watches to strangers she met in hotel bars. It wasn't kindness. It was a desperate attempt to buy a moment of human connection, a way to make someone look at her with something other than greed or pity. She was 43 years old, and she had run out of palaces to hide in. The Woolworth fortune, which had once seemed infinite, was beginning to bleed out through 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. Barbara Hutton was entering the final act of her life, a period where the gold dust would finally blow away, leaving nothing but the cold, hard reality of a woman who had spent $1 billion and ended up with nothing. By the late 1950s, the myth of the infinite Woolworth fortune began to crack. For decades, Barbara Hutton had treated her inheritance like a self-replenishing ocean, but even oceans can recede when the sun is too harsh. She was no longer just spending money. She was hemorrhaging it. The math of her life had become a grim ledger of million-dollar divorce settlements, parasitic friends, and a lifestyle that required a small army of servants, secretaries, and bodyguards just to sustain the illusion of her importance. In 1964, she married for the seventh and final time. Her groom was Prince Pierre Raymond Douanving na Champasak, a man with a title from a defunct Laotian kingdom. To the public, it was a farce, the aging heiress buying one last crown for her collection. To Barbara, it was a final, desperate gasp for air. The marriage, like all the others, dissolved into a mist of bitterness and legal fees. It lasted 2 years. It would be the last time she would ever say I do. But the true tragedy of this era was not a failed marriage, but the slow, agonizing erosion of her health. Barbara was now a skeletal figure, her body ravaged by decades of anorexia and drug abuse. She was frequently confined to a wheelchair, her bones so brittle that a slight stumble could lead to a fracture. Her once luminous skin had become translucent, stretched tight over a frame that seemed to be vibrating with a quiet, internal terror. She began to retreat into a world of pure fantasy. She spent her days in darkened hotel suites, surrounded by her legendary jewelry collection, the Marie Antoinette pearls, the Catherine the Great emeralds, the massive Pasha diamond. She would sit for hours, draped in millions of dollars worth of stones, talking to people who weren't there. The diamonds were her only loyal friends. They didn't lie, they didn't leave, and they didn't ask for a loan. But they were cold, and they offered no comfort when the night grew long. And then came the blow that truly broke her. In 1972, her only son, Lance Reventlow, was killed in a small plane crash in the Rocky Mountains. He was 36 years old. For Barbara, Lance was the only piece of her heart that was still tethered to the real world. Despite their complicated, often distant relationship, he was her legacy. He was the one thing she had made that wasn't for sale. When the news reached her, the last light in Barbara Hutton's eyes went out. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply went into a state of permanent, icy shock. With Lance gone, the reason to maintain the fortune vanished. She began to sell her properties, the palaces in Tangier, the mansions in Mexico, the apartments in Paris. She moved into the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles, taking up residence in a suite that became her entire world. Her spending became truly delusional. She was no longer buying homes or yachts. She was simply giving money to anyone who walked through her door. Her entourage, a shifting group of sycophants, failed actors, and professional hangers-on, drained her accounts with predatory efficiency. They would present with fake bills, inflated expenses, and investment opportunities that were nothing more than legalized theft. Barbara knew they were stealing from her. She simply didn't care. To her, the money was a curse she was finally happy to be rid of. By the early 1970s, the girl who had inherited nearly $1 billion in today's currency was being told by her lawyers that she was running out of cash. The Woolworth stores were struggling, her personal investments had been liquidated at pennies on the dollar, and the checkbook was finally beginning to bounce. The richest girl in the world was facing a terrifying new reality, a world where she was just an old woman in a hotel hell room with nothing left to buy her way out of the dark. The spiral was no longer a slow descent, it was a freefall, and the landing was going to be harder than anyone could have imagined. In the end, the world of Barbara Hutton, a world that had once spanned continents and encompassed the finest palaces of the old world, shrank to the size of a single bedroom in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. The girl who had been born into a retail empire built on the five and dime had come full circle. She was now a woman who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. By the mid-1970s, the Woolworth heiress was a phantom. She rarely left her bed, her body so frail that the weight of a silk sheet felt like a burden. Her hair, once a vibrant platinum, was thin and brittle. Her eyes, once the envy of Hollywood, were clouded by a lifetime of chemical fog. She spent her days in a state of semi-consciousness, drifting between memories of Cary Grant's laughter and the cold silence of her mother's room at the plaza. The fortune was gone. Not just depleted, but vanished, dissolved into a mist of bad investments, predatory lawyers, and the staggering cost of being Barbara Hutton. Of the billion-dollar legacy she had inherited, almost nothing remained. She began to sell her jewelry, the one thing she had vowed never to touch. One by one, the Marie Antoinette pearls and the great emeralds were carted off to auction houses to pay the hotel bill and the pharmacy tab. It was a slow-motion fire sale of a life. Her entourage had largely evaporated. When the money stopped flowing, the friends and the hangers-on found new targets, leaving Barbara in the care of a few remaining staff members who watched as the woman who once owned the world struggled to find a reason to wake up. She was lonely in a way that was absolute, a loneliness that no diamond could decorate. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton suffered a fatal heart attack in her hotel suite. She was 66 years old. When the lawyers and executors finally went through her belongings, they found a scene that was as haunting as it was telling. The richest girl in the world had died with a mere $3,500 in her bank account. Everything else was gone. The Woolworth fortune, built on the pennies and nickels of the American working class, had been entirely consumed by the void in Barbara's heart. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, placed in the massive, ornate Woolworth mausoleum alongside the mother she had lost and the grandfather who had built the empire. It is a structure of cold marble and stained glass, a final palace for a woman who spent her life trying to buy her way out of the shadows. The story of Barbara Hutton is often told as a morality tale about the curse of wealth, a warning that money cannot buy happiness. But that is too simple. Barbara's tragedy wasn't that she had too much money, it was that she had too little love. She was a child who was taught that her only worth was her price tag, and she spent 66 years trying to find someone who would prove the world wrong. She was a woman who lived her life in a display case, a gold dust twin who was never allowed to be human. When we look back at the photographs of the young Barbara, draped in mink and smiling for the cameras, we shouldn't see an icon of envy. We should see a girl who was walking into a storm with nothing but a checkbook to shield her. In the end, Barbara Hutton's greatest achievement wasn't her titles or her jewels. It was the fact that she survived as long as she did in a world that saw her only as a transaction. She was the poor little rich girl who finally found the one thing her grandfather's stores could never sell: peace. The lights have long since gone out at Winfield House and C.D. Hosny, and the diamonds have all found new owners. But the ghost of Barbara Hutton remains. A reminder that in the grand tally of a human life, the things we hold in our hands are never as important as the things we hold in our hearts. And for Barbara, the ledger was finally closed.